Dear unknown friend, it is difficult to briefly summarize the profound work of Valentin Tomberg and his book Meditations on the Tarot, a journey into Christian Hermeticism. Those who love this work almost invariably spend years, if not decades, immersed in studying it. This is in part due to its immense breadth and depth in terms of both scholarly and academic excellence. But far more important than its intellectual rigor is its profoundly deep spiritual insight. Having said this, I would say the central theme of his work, its center of gravity, if you will, is the concept of sacred magic, the remainder of the book being essentially compelling commentary on the same. So, what is sacred magic? We would say it is nothing other than the process of the reunification of human and divine will. And for this reason, it is also the process of spiritual evolution, theosis, purification, gradual sublimation, and ascent of the soul towards the celestial. Please enjoy this experience.
Valentin Tomberg was born in St. Petersburg, Russia, on February 26, 1900. As a young man, he joined the Geo-Mabes Martinist school in St. Petersburg. During the Bolshevik Revolution, Tomberg was forced to flee Russia, and soon after arriving in Eastern Europe, he joined the anthroposophical school of Rudolf Steiner, where he became a prominent yet controversial figure. Tomberg's efforts to bring new thoughts, new insights into the spiritual science of Rudolf Steiner were not always well received by the anthroposophical community. And during World War II, Tomberg had a mystical religious experience, which led to him leaving behind anthroposophy and converting to Catholicism. Tomberg seems to have led a relatively quiet life for the next 2 decades, and it was in these years he became very focused on the Catholic Eucharist and a contemplative life. This time period is when his magnum opus, the highly regarded Meditations on the Tarot, a journey into Christian Hermeticism, was written, and he completed at least a rough version of the manuscript in May of 1967. Tomberg opens his 3rd chapter on the Empress with, quote, "The 3rd arcanum, the Empress, is that of sacred magic. Now, there are 3 kinds of magic. Magic, where the magician is the instrument of divine power. This is sacred magic. Magic, where the magician himself is the source of the magical operation. This is personal magic. Lastly, magic where the magician is the instrument of elemental forces or other unconscious forces. This is sorcery." The teaching of the 3rd arcanum, in view of the context of the card and its place between the 2nd and 4th arcana, refers to sacred or divine magic. All magic, including sorcery, is the putting into practice of this, that the subtle rules, the dense, force, matter, consciousness, force, and the superconscious or divine consciousness. It is this latter rulership that the Empress symbolizes. Her crown, scepter, and shield, coat of arms, are the 3 instruments of the exercise of this power. The crowned head indicates the power of the divine over consciousness. The right arm, according to the viewer of the card, which bears a scepter topped by a cross mounted on a globe of gold, represents the power of consciousness over force. And the left arm, which carries a shield bearing an eagle, signifies the power of energy over matter, or the volatile over the gross. Unquote. The eagle mentioned by Tomberg is of particular interest in this card, as it symbolically relates both to the sublimated nature of Scorpio, this sign being perhaps most directly connected to an alchemical and cathartic process of the purification of the soul and the Gospel of John. The Gospel Tomberg mentions frequently as a shining example of a sacred magical text. Tomberg says towards the end of the chapter, quote, "We have said above that sacred magic is life, such as it was before the fall. As life is always generative, the arcanum of sacred magic is at the same time that of generation before the fall. vertical generation, from a higher plane to a lower one, instead of horizontal generation, which is accomplished on a single plane." Unquote. This restoration of the so-called Edenic state is further elaborated in another wonderful work by Tomberg, titled The Covenant of the Heart, originally and later published as Lazarus Come Forth. In this later work, Tomberg demonstrates a correlation between the 7 signs in the Gospel of John and the 7 days of creation in Genesis. The first, being the wedding at Cana, correlates to the 7th day of creation in Genesis. The second sign, the healing of the nobleman's son, corresponds to the 6th day of creation, and so forth, until one reaches the 7th sign, the raising of Lazarus, which corresponds to the 1st day of creation and the end of death. In this way, Tomberg implies that the purpose of sacred magic is purely theurgical, and similar to the Neoplatonic traditions, where the aim is henosis, or, in the context of Genesis, the restoration of man in Eden. Tomberg no doubt sees the Eucharist as the epitome of a sacred magical or theurgical rite, facilitating a sublimation of the base nature of man, and his ultimate return to the image and likeness. This way of perceiving is not entirely unique to Tomberg. We see a similar thought process in the works of the Syrian Neoplatonist Iamblichus, where one ascends the celestial spheres through theurgical methods, hoping to escape the cycle of birth and rebirth, and enter into the domain of the One or the Good. One finds a similar outlook in many Kabbalistic schools, especially the Toledano tradition, where the trees of life depicted in the 4 olamot or worlds interpenetrate one another and become Jacob's ladder, the stepping stones of spiritual ascent and divine realization of the human soul. At the end of Tomberg's work on the tarot, in his chapter on the world, he returns somewhat to his beginnings with the school of Geomebes and suggests to his dear unknown friends that they take up meditation and contemplation of the minor arcana themselves, understanding that these arcana represent the Sephiroth in the 4 universes. Olam ha-Aziluth, corresponding to the numeric cards of the 1 suit, Olam ha-Bria to the cups, Olam ha-Yetzira to the swords, and Olam ha-Asiya to the pentacles. He further explains that this system correlates to the 4 letters of the Tetragrammaton, and the Greek term, popular in Eastern Orthodoxy, theosis. Theosis has a definite theurgical theme, conveying as it does a 3-fold process of purification, illumination, and union. Tomberg quite cleverly reconciles the problem of there being 3 stages of theosis, and yet 4 tarot suits, by adding an additional stage, that of preparation, which he correlates to the Pentacles suit of Olam ha-Asiya. It is important to understand that Tomberg certainly departed somewhat from the Martinist school of thought, as it was taught by Mabes, in the same way he did from the Steiner school, yet the template provided by the Mabes school basically remains in his suggestions at the end of Meditations on the Tarot. Anyone interested in taking up this work on the Minor Arcanum, I would highly recommend looking over the Tarot Minors, published a few years back by Shin Publishing. You may also find interesting information on the Mabes School at the YouTube channel Alchemical Weddings, which serves as a media outlet for Shin Publishing. This book has a more occult science approach to inner work than the theurgical emphasis that we find suggested by Tomberg and the likes of Iamblichus. That said, there are some very interesting methods of working. I was particularly intrigued with some of its contents that border on what we might call astro-theurgical theory. The concept of balancing the 7 planets within ourselves has definite Neoplatonic inspiration behind it. There is much there that is valuable for practicing astrologers, and like the Tomberg model, the initiation process is described as ascending the 4 suits or Kabbalistic olamot. Another work I find well worth mentioning is by Tomberg himself, albeit it was never intended for publication. and that would be The Wandering Fool, which is simply a collection of Tomberg's notes for meditations on the tarot that appear to be an early outline for his tarot work. Sadly, the work only covers the major arcanum from Temperance to the World, the remaining notes for the other arcanum being missing. Yet there are some bits and pieces that illuminate some ideas found in Meditations on the Tarot that were less well fleshed out. One might ask, is there a Catholic history of Neoplatonic thought of this sort? And there is indeed, at the very least, and maybe most profoundly, the work of Pseudo-Dionysius. Here are the opening lines from the Celestial Hierarchy. Inspired by the Father, each procession of light spreads itself generously toward us, and, in its power to unify, it stirs us up by lifting us up. It returns us back to the oneness and deifying simplicity of the Father who gathers us in. However, this divine ray can enlighten us only by being upliftingly concealed in a variety of sacred veils, which the providence of the Father adapts to our nature as human beings. Here we have an almost Kabbalistic and theurgical understanding once more. These sacred veils are the Christian symbols and the practices of the liturgy. Pseudo-Dionysius stresses that we human beings need perceptible things to lift us up toward God, which is quite similar to the tokens of Iamblichus. He says, quote, "For it is quite impossible that we humans should, in any material way, rise up to imitate and to contemplate the heavenly hierarchies without the aid of those material means capable of guiding us as our nature requires." Unquote. In a way very similar to the theurgy of Iamblichus, Pseudo-Dionysius shows how, through these material means and perceptible things, we are raised toward God and divinized. For him, these means are found above all in the Christian liturgy. He explains that participation in the liturgy leads us into union and communion with the divine, using varied symbolism determined from the realm of perception. Symbolism by means of which there is a sacred uplifting to the divine. Consider, for instance, how Pseudo-Dionysius describes the Eucharist in explicitly theurgic terms. The hierarch, or the priest, speaks in praise of the most sacred works of God, sets about the performance of the most divine acts, and lifts into view the things praised through the sacredly displayed symbols. Having thus revealed the kindly gifts of the works of God, he himself comes into communion with them and exhorts the others to follow him. The priest performs the most divine acts, unveils the sacred symbols, enters into communion himself, and calls the others to join him in this theurgic ascent, a true, sacred uplifting to the divine. Let us return briefly to the work of Iamblichus, where the celestial spheres, or 7 traditional planets, the moon through Saturn, represent descent into incarnation or involution, as well as spiritual ascent and stepping stones towards the ultimate goal of completing the great work and achieving kenosis. In incarnation, the theurgical rites of Iamblichus served a twofold purpose: liberation from what the Kabbalist called Gilgalim, the endless cycles of birth, life, death, and repeated incarnations, and the purification of the soul to bring down or become receptive to the divine light while incarnate. Tomberg says something to the effect that a miracle is simply the laws and principles of a higher plane of existence, becoming active in a lower plane of existence. This echoes back to the idea that the subtle rules the dense. The disciples of Iamblichus claim he was capable of miraculous healings, levitation, and even glowed with a golden light while levitating on one occasion. The focus of the work of Iamblichus was purification of what we may call the passions, or, in the East, the vasanas, and he saw these as related to the planetary spheres. Many Gnostic schools look upon the planets as equivalent to the archons, and unlike Iamblichus, they see these intelligences as only negative, preventing liberation and imprisoning man in matter. According to the living fire tradition, this is a half-truth, in that when one rises in the planes, or through the celestial spheres, as Iamblichus understood it, one faces something akin to the guardian of the threshold at each gate. Depending on the individual soul, these can manifest as negative experiences of so-called archons, or stepping stones and purifying agents. This all dependent on the soul's state of consciousness, the soul's own inclinations, predispositions, vasanas, desires, both conscious and subconscious. The model that Iamblichus presents is exactly like the more popular Golden Dawn model, where we see the planets correlated to the Sephiroth in the following ascending order: Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Saturn representing the sphere of profound spiritual understanding. Each sphere provided an astral substance taken on in incarnation that had to be cast off as the soul went through a process of purgation. Should the soul find itself clinging to the desires of the flesh, it would be drawn back down into earthly incarnation. A writer has written, quote, "The angelic intelligence of each celestial sphere was primarily there as a means of assisting the soul in efforts towards purification. One could be drawn in by the licentious and erotic compulsion of Venus. As the third sphere in ascent, it is associated with erotic love, desire, beauty, generation, and the principle of harmonious attraction. In the soul's descent into matter, the Venusian influence imparts the capacity for love, but in its material form, this becomes distorted into sensual passion, attachment to physical beauty, and reproductive urges. In the ascent, the theurgist invokes the higher, purified aspect of Aphrodite. Through specific theurgic rites, synthemata, symbols, sacred to Venus, for instance certain stones, plants, hymns, numbers, or rituals, performed at astrologically auspicious times, the soul is filled with divine eros, a spiritual love that draws it upward toward higher beauty and unity. This Venusian love is no longer possessive or bodily, but becomes the anagogic force leading upward that harmonizes the soul and orients it toward the intellectual beauty of higher realms. It transforms earthly desire into a longing for the divine, acting as a kind of cosmic magnetism." Unquote.
Before we close this episode out, we would like to mention the recently released novel published by Living Fire Publishing called The Philosophers of the Living Fire, The Dance of Life by Richard Porter Adair. In this book, we find the true story of a young man known as Robin Gordon, who, after meeting an initiate and magician, a mentor and friend named Martinism, encounters quite directly the problem of arbitrary or personal magic, occult science and its various pitfalls versus the path of sacred magic. Indeed, both forms of magic are found in the pages. We see bathing in the ocean for many weeks as a cure for psychic attack, use of mind control techniques by black magicians, and even a claim of having discovered the elixir of life. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, share our content with those who might be interested. We are told these things help the channel. And check out our website and school. In 2026, we will offer the teachings of the degree of silence, also called the degree of the swords. These teachings are heavily focused on our tradition's theurgical methods. Happy solstice and Merry Christmas to one and all, the philosophers of the living fire.